This is session 4, and this is a sign of toxicity in culture, is motivates through fear. And I would also say is motivated by fear. I remember when this really occurred to me in a big way. I was reading the Hebrew story of oppression in Exodus and sort of the actual undoing of that oppression and God's design for that. I was reading it, and just this line began to stand out for me. It said that Pharaoh, because he was afraid of the Israelites, began to oppress them. And I suddenly realized that fear is the currency of oppression. So fear is what drives oppression. So even if your motive is good, if you're motivated by fear or through fear, it will always lead you into an oppressive cycle. If your decisions are motivated by fear, you will either end up oppressed or you'll end up being an oppressor, because the cycle of oppression is fueled by fear. It's its currency. So one of the signs of a toxic culture is when fear is the primary motivator and is celebrated as a primary motivator, fear. These are often revealed as threats and or punishment. They can be vague or they can be specific. So sometimes fear is perpetuated because the threats are actually real threats, and you have to live with the consequences of a fear-based culture. This can be a particularly hard thing to spot because I think we live in a culture of fear. So fear is the thing that sells the news, right? Like fear is the thing that keeps everybody going back to their social media stuff. So like fear is so prevalent in our culture. It's actually so normalized that it's kind of hard to spot. But once you begin to spot it, even in your own life and your own motives, you can begin to see how prevalent it is in your own culture and your own system. So a culture of fear. She's a Nobel Peace Prize winner from Liberia. And one of the key components of her strategy in mobilizing 300,000 women to protest and to pray together to oust one of the worst dictators in Liberia's history, Charles Taylor, who was just wreaking havoc, literally imprisoning children as soldiers and child soldiers and drugs and all kinds of things, just a terrible despot. And she remembers the day when she said, I actually remember the day when I walked across another dead body, because there was just havoc in Liberia. And she said, I walked across this dead body, and up until this moment, she said, everyone was too afraid to say anything against Charles Taylor. I stepped over it without any thought, without any grief, without any lament, without any, it was a normal day. I had just gone on with this death as a culture. And she said, it struck me that I was now dead unless I began to do something. So there was this, and that's when really she started to get unafraid, where she came out of agreement with fear as a currency of oppression, that we would just keep doing this and doing this and doing this until walking over dead bodies is a normal day in the life of a Liberian. She just said, absolutely not. And she began to come out of this culture of fear and began to speak up to say, this is not what I want for my country. And then that began to attract some other people. And before you know it, there's 300,000 of them camped out in front of the president's office. But she said what was really interesting about this whole thing is a large part of what she was most afraid of didn't happen when she actually came out of agreement with fear and spoke up and started using her voice and sharing that with other people. She said the height of the fear of speaking out against Charles Taylor was the possibility of what might happen if you spoke out against Charles Taylor. So Malcolm Gladwell, in his book, David and Goliath, talks about this in cultures, but he says the fear of the threat and the punishment, of what might happen, the fear of the fear itself, the fear of the fear of what's happening is most palpable before something actually happens. When the thing actually happens, when there's a protest and you're arrested, when there's disclosure and you're wrapped up in public reality of that, when this thing actually happens and there's a confrontation, the fear is no longer as present. The fear is most intense before, and it lives in this illusion of possibility. And that's a really important, it doesn't really help you when you're in it because you still have to walk through that fear, but it's a really important thing to remember that fear is not only the currency of oppression, it's also illusion. And that presentation, that illusion of this being so terrible and so horrible and so wrong keeps people perpetually in the state of fear and never actually lends to any resolve. I was thinking about this recently when a friend of mine, it was disclosed finally that they were in an inappropriate relationship with the founder of a company. It turns out it was actually not an affair. And as we began to talk, she started to share about how living in fear, living in the threat of exposure, living under this like constant sense of like, we're afraid to be who we are, to be honest, to walk in the light, all those sort of things. And really she actually, I think, tried to take her life several times. She spent a lot of energy every day just trying to will herself to stay alive. Part of that is she's trapped in an abusive cycle. Fear is toxic. And cultures that use fear, threats, intimidation, punishments, those are toxic places to be in. And those are all signs of a very toxic culture. We have to push back against the illusion of fear that perpetuates such toxicity in our cultures. We have to be people who refuse to allow fear to be our motivator, but instead confront that fear and walk to the challenge that actual fear presents, and go on from there. Now, one of the things as we move on through this course, you'll see is that these are not individual things that happen, isolated from each other, these toxic traits of unhealthy cultures. They're all a jumbled mess. You can start to see how some of these things are like layers and they interweave with one another. And fear is one of these things too, right? That's perpetuated. Fear is an illusion. I remember I've worked for many, many years with women coming out of sexual exploitation. And I remember one of the great problems in trying to get women to come to their own decisions about like coming out of toxic and bad exploitative relationships was just light. And I remember sitting down with this one woman who kept referring to her pimp as a boyfriend. Why don't we sit down together and make a list of like a healthy relationship and then a toxic pimping relationship and see if we can get some light together about this relationship. The people that I was in, the culture that I was in was not a healthy relationship. I was not in healthy relationship with the organization that I was a part of. Or I didn't know when I had paid for the rent or not paid for there are all these different things. Even that fear that like, what if I'm actually honest with myself that I'm not in a healthy relationship with this organization? And again, we've talked about this a bit, but I'd like to talk about it again, just a family dynamic that might be suffering from abuse. And you'll notice this in cultures that are toxic in their motivation by fear, in this question like what will happen if. So for example, like my friend who was abused by her pastor, the pastor would constantly say like, if this comes to light, if this ever comes out, my family's going to be destroyed. If this ever comes out, and would paint these pictures of punitive, terrible, horrible fallout. Now, some of those things might actually be genuine consequences of that kind of a life. But some of those things were just fear as a motivator to keep somebody quiet and living in fear. That church is still alive and going. The kingdom work that God does is never thwarted by one bad man. This other person I told you about who finally decided it was worth living for the first time in a long time once she came out of this culture of fear. When you think about the what if from a positive, from a motivation of love, there's the consequences of living in truth. The consequences of actually not being motivated by fear is to liberate so many other people too. Or maybe we might be able to help other people come out of the slavery and the enslavement of fear. There's so many what ifs, but a toxic culture will only emphasize the what ifs from a fear perspective. It's always going to be terrible and it's always going to be coming for you. That's fear. In many instances, I think of fear like I think of Thanos. He's just all powerful and stomping around all the time, snapping his fingers, going, I'm inevitable. Like this, I'm just going to destroy everything. And then, of course, if you're a Marvel fan, you know that he is defeated. Thanos is defeated. But it does look like he's going to win. It does look like he's all powerful. It does look like it's impossible to defeat. That's fear, right? Just this total bulk up, grandized illusion of ultimate control and authority. But fear and Thanos is not inevitable, actually. There is only one inevitability. There is only one inevitability, and it's love. It's freedom, and it's coming.